Hi guys, it's Geekonomics here, and you rejoin me once again on classical theory, where we're now going to look and consider the short-run Phillips curve and the long-run Phillips curve, and then relate that to our classical theory, which we know fondly from year one economics. So you will be familiar with the whole notion of a Phillips curve, I'm sure. So the Phillips curve states that if an economy wants to lower the level of unemployment, so we want to move towards the origin in this case, then it will have to accept a little bit more inflation as a consequence. And let's just examine how that might work in practice. So here we have, let's say we're starting at point A, and it's dangerous territory of course, point A, because we're very close to deflation. But we're at point A, and the government of the day wishes to reduce the level of unemployment. And so once again, they inject some type of monetary stimulus into the economy to stimulate AD. AD rises and unemployment falls. And so we initially, in the first instance, we move along short-run Phillips curve 1. Now again, I said to you in the first instance, so in the short term, we move from A to B. And those of you who've watched my previous video about the sort of traditional classical relationship between AD and AS, you'll be familiar with the way in which we've used that notion of short-term movement. So we move to point B. So that's all fine and dandy in terms of unemployment. So unemployment's fallen, but what's happened to the rate of inflation? Well, the rate of inflation, ladies and gentlemen, have gone up. Now, in the first instance, we're assuming that it takes people a little bit of time just to gather their thoughts. We're talking maybe a few months here to assimilate what's actually going on in the economy. So once that feeds through, they think to themselves, right, so prices have gone up, my money wage is staying the same, so therefore if I earn £100 a week and previously everything I bought was £10, I could buy 10 of them. Now, my money wage is still 100, but everything I'm buying is now 2% more expensive. I need a 2% pay rise in order to restore my purchasing power. And so as a consequence, they will of course ask for a wage rise. What does that do? Well, it increases the firm's costs. And the firm then realizes, well, actually, we can't afford to employ these additional workers. And so we end up back at point C, which is the level of unemployment U1 that we started off with. The only difference being that now we're sitting on a higher rate of inflation because we're sitting on Phillips curve 2 instead of Phillips curve 1. And that relationship between inflation and unemployment, that has still stayed the same, but we're simply operating now on a higher Phillips curve with a higher rate of inflation. So, if the process was repeated, same thing would happen. We go from C to E in the short term, but in the long term, we'd end up moving back. Sorry, we've got these labelled the wrong way around, haven't we? Let's just fix that. So it should be E, it should be D. So we go from C to D in the short term, but in the long term, we end up back at point E. Now, I hope that you can see a little pattern here, ladies and gentlemen, with respect to points A, C and E. And if we were to join those points together, A, C and D, and keep going, because this procedure would just keep going and going, you can see that we have a perfectly inelastic curve. Now, in my previous video, we talked about the classical aggregate supply curve being perfectly inelastic. Here we have something very, very similar, ladies and gentlemen, almost a perfect substitute indeed, but this is not the short-run Phillips curve, this is the long-run Phillips curve. And in effect, it is showing us exactly the same thing as the classical aggregate supply curve, in respect of the fact that if a government or monetary authority tries to reduce unemployment, the only thing that happens in the long term is that you jump from A to C, and then C to E, and then E to G, etc., etc. Join the points together, and you get this long-run Phillips curve. And we mentioned that on the previous video where we looked at the similar points on the classical aggregate supply curve. Now when we were talking about this on the previous video, these points were called the NAIRU, non-accelerating inflation rates of unemployment, and again these are referred to as the NAIRU. In classical theory, that level of output consistent with those price levels were all referred to as the natural rate of unemployment. And again, we can call this YN. This is equivalent to the natural rate of unemployment. And this is where in classical theory, we always end up back at this point, because any deviations are only short term. Now, as I mentioned to my students this morning, even these deviations you could sort of think of these deviations as being rubbed out, because if this procedure becomes embedded and ingrained in policy, then people will simply react as follows. Rather than producing more output and employing more people, they will say to themselves, well, we know that in a few months' time all these people will be let go because we'll just have to give them a pay rise. So what we'll do instead of that, to quit any messing around, rather than going from A to B to C, we expect you to be using this policy, and so as a consequence we will factor that into our plans. And so therefore we will anticipate rationally, and hence this theory is sometimes called rational expectations theory, we will anticipate that you will do this, and therefore we will automatically build in a 2% pay rise and then another 2% pay rise. And so actually any attempts by the government or the monetary authorities even to reduce unemployment in the short term then become totally obsolete because of this rational expectation that is built in to the minds of the owners of firms and businesses. And so rather than moving A to B to C, we simply go A to C. So you've got your increase in your money supply. What happens? All you get is an increase in the price level instantaneously. Rather than going from C to D to E, what happens? We simply go straight from C to E. And so you eliminate, as a consequence, you eliminate even these short-term deviations from the natural rate of unemployment. Now, you can use this theory to, particularly when you're looking at inflation targeting and why it's useful for, say, the Monetary Policy Committee in the UK, why it's useful for them, therefore, to have this 2% target for inflation. And that's something that we'll maybe think about in a previous video, in a subsequent video. But I think we'll leave it at that. There's quite a lot to take in on that one, and I don't want to go too quickly with too much content on these videos. So I'm going to leave it at that, ladies and gentlemen. Bye for now.